Hello, and welcome to the Intuitive Ouija. Thanks for clicking on my story. Before we begin, drop your city or country in the comments. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from. The Ouija board only speaks in riddles. We solved the first one, and now the river outside is running backwards. We thought it was a bizarre coincidence, a trick of the light, anything but what it truly was. The first click of a lock on a door we never meant to open. It was Leo's idea, of course, born from a rainy October evening and a bottle of cheap bourbon that did little to warm the cramped, book-cluttered living room of our shared graduate student housing, a place that smelled perpetually of damp wool and microwave noodles. The board itself was a relic from Leo's childhood, a faded cardboard sheet tucked away in a box of forgotten things, its plastic planchette clouded with age. It's psychology, he'd insisted, his eyes alight with that manic curiosity that made him both brilliant and infuriating. Ideomotor effect, pure and simple. Our subconscious minds guiding our own hands. It'll be a laugh. Sarah, ever the pragmatist, had rolled her eyes but agreed to play along, her long fingers resting next to mine on the planchette, while Mark, the most superstitious of us, hesitated, his broad frame seeming to shrink at the prospect. Bad vibes, man, he'd mumbled, but Leo's infectious enthusiasm, or perhaps the bourbon, won out, and soon our fingertips were pressed together on that little heart-shaped window, the room silent except for the ticking of the radiator and the drumming of rain against the window pane. The first contact was a joke, a series of gibberish letters that Leo dismissed as our collective twitchiness. But then the planchette began to move with a purpose that felt alien, a smooth, cold glide that was utterly detached from the minute tremors of our muscles. It spelled not a name, not a greeting, but a question, or what we mistook for one. I have a bed, but I never sleep. I have a mouth, but I never eat. What am I? We laughed, a nervous, relieved sound that echoed in the quiet room. A river, Mark said with a shrug, the tension bleeding from his shoulders. It's a river. See? A riverbed, a mouth. Kid stuff. And we all agreed, feeling clever, the bourbon warming us again as we moved on to other topics, the board forgotten for the night. It wasn't until the next morning, when Sarah pointed out the window with a confused frown, that the first thread of unease began to unravel within me. The Charles River, a sluggish, brown ribbon that wound past our apartment complex, was indeed flowing backwards, its current defying gravity and geography, pulling water upstream in a silent, impossible reversal. We stood at the window for a long time, trying to rationalize it. A trick of the wind, rare tidal effect we'd never noticed, a waking dream. But the truth was a cold stone in my gut. The riddle had been an answer, not a question, and in speaking its solution aloud, we had given it permission to become true. That was the beginning of our obsession, a sickness that started not with a scream, but with a puzzled silence. Leo, the scientist, was electrified. He dismissed our fear as primitive nonsense, instead seeing a phenomenon to be documented, a puzzle to be cracked. He bought a large whiteboard and erected it in the living room like a monument to our folly, transcribing every message the board would later give us. Sarah, a literature student, was fascinated by the linguistic and poetic structure of the riddles, treating them like obscure texts to be deconstructed. Only Mark and I felt the true weight of what we had done, the chilling preciseness of the curse. But our protests were drowned out by Leo's fervor and Sarah's intellectual curiosity. We went back to the board that very evening, not as skeptics seeking a laugh, but as supplicants seeking an explanation. Our fingers touched the planchette, and after a moment of stillness that felt like a held breath, it moved again, sliding with that same unnerving fluidity. It is always coming but never arrives. Yesterday is gone, tomorrow is lost without it. What is it? We were quieter this time. The image of the backwards flowing river burned into our minds. Today, Sarah ventured, but the planchette didn't slide to yes. The present moment? I suggested, feeling foolish. Again, no movement. It was Mark, his voice barely a whisper, who said, "Tomorrow. It's always coming, but it never actually gets here." The moment the word left his lips, The planchette shot to yes with a force that felt violent, and a profound silence fell over the room. A silence that was broken an hour later when Mark received a phone call from his mother. His younger brother, a bright-eyed boy named Jake whom Mark had been planning to visit tomorrow for weeks, had been in a car accident. He was alive, but in a coma, his future, his tomorrow, irrevocably lost. Mark's face crumpled, and the sound he made was not a cry but a gasp of pure, horrified understanding. The curse was not just about altering the world around us. It was about twisting the very concepts we lived by, turning our words into weapons against us. We should have stopped then. We should have burned the board, scattered its ashes, and fled that apartment. But a terrible, morbid fascination had taken root. Leo argued that we now had a responsibility to understand the mechanism, to find a way to reverse it. A logic that felt flimsy even to my own terrified mind, but which I clung to because the alternative, that we were simply damned, was too vast to comprehend. Sarah, her literary mind now fully engaged, saw a pattern, a syntax of malevolence. "It's not communicating," she said, her eyes wide and feverish. "It's programming. The riddles are commands. The answers are the execution keys." Our sessions became a dreadful ritual. We would dim the lights, place our fingers on the planchette, and wait for the next cryptic message, each one a fresh landmine in the field of our lives. "I have cities but no houses, forests but no trees, and rivers but no water. What am I?" We deliberated for hours, terrified of answering, until Leo, driven by a need to prove his theory, gritted his teeth and said, "A map." The next morning, every map, every GPS signal in a 5-mile radius was wrong. Streets led to dead ends that shouldn't exist, familiar landmarks were gone, and our neighborhood became an unnavigable labyrinth, trapping us in a geography that had been redrawn by a malicious cartographer. The more you take, the more you leave behind. What am I? We knew this one, footsteps, but refused to speak it for days, until the silence itself became unbearable. Finally, I whispered the answer, and from that moment on, none of us could move without leaving behind perfect, wet, phantom footprints on any surface, a trail of our presence that could not be wiped away, a constant, dripping reminder that we were being tracked, our every step witnessed. The horror was no longer external. It was seeping into our minds, into the fabric of our identities. The next riddle was a masterstroke of psychological torture. "I am yours, but everyone else uses me more than you do." What am I? We became paranoid, suspicious of each other, of our friends, our families. Who is using what? Our names? Our reputations? The planchette lingered on the letters of Sarah's name for a terrifying second before moving on, and she spent a week in a state of near catatonia, convinced that everyone she knew was conspiring against her. The apartment, once a sanctuary, became a prison of our own making, the air thick with fear and the unspoken accusation that one of us was the key to this particular curse. The walls seemed to press in, the reversed river outside our window a constant symbol of a world undone. We were fraying at the edges. Mark barely slept, jumping at every sound, his concern for his brother now magnified into a generalized terror. Leo's scientific detachment had evaporated, replaced by a frantic, desperate energy as he scrawled increasingly deranged diagrams on the whiteboard, trying to find a pattern, a loophole, a way to talk back to the void. Sarah retreated into a shell of silence, her love for language perverted into a fear of words themselves. And I, the narrator of this slow-motion disaster, could feel my own sanity slipping, each rational thought replaced by a superstitious dread that colored every moment. Then came the riddle that broke us completely. The planchette spelled out the words with a slow, deliberate cruelty. "You call me by name, and I disappear." What am I? This one felt different, heavier. We debated the possibilities in hushed, frantic tones. Silence. Leo barked, but nothing happened. The past. Sarah offered weakly. Again, nothing. We spent a day in terrified silence, afraid to even suggest an answer. It was Mark, staring at a photograph of his brother taped to the fridge, who uttered the word, his voice hollow with a grief he had not yet been allowed to feel. "Tomorrow," he said. You call out for tomorrow, and it's always today. As before, the planchette slammed to yes. The phone rang exactly 1 minute later. It was Mark's mother. Jake was gone. He had never woken up. The curse had taken the concept of tomorrow from him twice. First his future, and now, with the speaking of the word, his very life. Mark did not cry. He let out a low, guttural moan that seemed to tear itself from the deepest part of his soul. And then he stood, walked to the whiteboard, and smashed his fist through it, sending shards of plastic and streaks of red ink flying across the room. He turned to us, his eyes wild with a pain that was beyond madness, and screamed, "No more! We burn it! We burn it now!" This time, there was no argument. We gathered the board, the planchette, and every note we had taken, and we took them down to the concrete courtyard behind our building, next to the impossibly flowing river. The air was cold and still. Leo doused the pile in lighter fluid, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the can. As Mark struck the match, a wind kicked up from nowhere, a gust that came from downstream, from the wrong direction, and snuffed the flame out. He struck another, and another, each one dying as if the air itself refused to allow the combustion. It was then that the planchette, lying on top of the pile, began to move on its own, sliding in a slow, deliberate circle. We watched, frozen in horror, as it lifted into the air, suspended by an invisible force, and pointed at each of us in turn before dropping back onto the cardboard. The message was clear. The game was not over. It would never be over. We fled back to the apartment, leaving the unholy artifacts untouched, our attempted exorcism a catastrophic failure. That night, the final riddle came to us not through the board, but in our dreams, a single phrase whispered in unison into our sleeping minds, a phrase that woke us all at the same moment, our screams harmonizing in the dark. What belongs to you but is used by everyone else? This was the ultimate trap. We knew, with the certainty of the damned, that this was the last one. Solving it would not bring freedom. It would consummate the curse, finalize our fate. But not solving it was also a form of torture, the unspoken answer hanging over us like a guillotine blade. We stopped eating, stopped sleeping, living in a perpetual state of terrified anticipation. The apartment was a tomb. The reversed river outside was now clogged with debris, a stagnant, stinking reminder of a broken natural order. Mark had retreated into a near catatonic state, rocking back and forth in a corner, muttering his brother's name. Sarah was frantically scribbling in a notebook, trying every possible word, every philosophical concept, but refusing to speak any of them aloud. Leo was gone, his mind shattered. He'd become convinced that the answer was fate or destiny, and had barricaded himself in his room, screaming at the walls about quantum causality. I was the last one holding on to a shred of reason, but it was a thin, fraying thread. I watched my friends disintegrate, and I knew that the answer was something simple, something horrifyingly intimate. My name, but that had been hinted at before. My body, that felt too crude, too physical for the entity's poetic cruelty. Days bled into one another, a smear of fear and exhaustion. The silence was broken only by the sound of Mark's rocking and Sarah's frantic writing. Then, on the third day, Sarah looked up from her notebook, her eyes clear for the first time in weeks. She had figured it out. She looked at me, and then at the broken shell of Mark, and a terrible, resigned peace settled on her face. "It's the only thing that makes sense," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. "It's what it's been taking from us all along." She stood up and walked over to Mark, kneeling in front of him. "Mark," she said softly. He didn't respond, lost in his private hell. "Mark, the answer is your life." The moment the words left her mouth, Mark stopped rocking. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with a final, lucid terror. He opened his mouth as if to scream, but no sound came out. Instead, he simply deflated. The life went out of his eyes like a snuffed candle, and he slumped to the floor dead. Not from a heart attack, not from any physical cause, but because the concept of his life, which belonged to him but had been used and taken by the entity, by his brother's death, by this entire ordeal, had been called back. It had been used up. Sarah stared at his body, a strange smile on her lips. I was right, she whispered, before turning and walking calmly out of the apartment. I found her an hour later, standing on the bank of the reversed river, her body rigid, her mind completely vacant. The entity had taken her mind, her sanity, the thing that had been most hers, and which she had used to solve its puzzles. She was an empty shell, a monument to her own intellect. And now I am alone. Leo is still in his room, laughing and crying about strings of fate. Sarah is catatonic in a hospital. Mark is dead, and I am left with the riddle. I know the answer now. I understood it the moment Sarah spoke the words that killed Mark. The thing that belongs to you but is used by everyone else is not your life, not your name, not your body. It is your story, your experience, your perception, the narrative of your existence that others tell, that they borrow from, that they use to define their own lives. The entity wasn't just cursing us, it was feeding on our narrative, using our lives as its text, our tragedies as its poetry. And by understanding this, by holding this final, terrible answer in my mind, I have become the last unsolved riddle. I cannot speak it, for to do so would be to end my own story, to allow it to be consumed completely. But by not speaking it, I am trapped forever in this moment, the sole remaining witness to a horror that has become the entire fabric of my being. The game never ends because I am the game. The planchette is gone, the board is gone, but the riddle remains, ticking like a bomb inside my skull. It is my voice you hear now, my testimony, but it is no longer mine alone. It belongs to you, the listener, and to everyone else who will use it, who will borrow this terror and make it a part of their own world. So I ask you, the final, unspoken question that hangs in the air between us, a curse I can never voice, but which you have now, inevitably, begun to solve for yourself. What belongs to you, but is used by everyone else? And so I sit in this silence that is no longer silent because it is filled with the echoes of their voices and the relentless, rushing sound of the river flowing the wrong way outside my window, a sound that has become the soundtrack to my damnation, a perpetual reminder that the rules of reality are not just broken, but have been rewritten by a malevolent poet. The apartment is a museum of our collective insanity. Leo's shattered whiteboard still leaning against the wall, its cryptic scrawls now just meaningless graffiti, a map to a hell we have already reached. I don't leave because there is nowhere to go. The outside world, with its wrong-way streets and its impossible geography, is just a larger extension of this curse, and besides, my own phantom footsteps would trace my path for any unseen thing to follow, a trail of my own fear leading right back to me. I survive on canned goods and tap water, though I often wonder if the water, sourced from that backwards river, is carrying some essential wrongness into my body, realigning my cells against the grain of nature itself. I can hear Leo sometimes, through the thin wall of his bedroom, his voice a ragged scratch, now arguing not with us, but with the entity directly, pleading with it to reveal the variables in its equation, to show him the grand unified theory of suffering. And his laughter that follows is the most terrifying sound of all, because it is the sound of a mind that has found its answer and found it wanting, a hollow, echoing victory. I tried to check on him once, pushing the door open against the chair he'd used as a barricade, and I found him crouched in a corner, surrounded by equations carved into the plaster with a spoon, his eyes wide and unseeing, focused on some terrible interior landscape. He didn't recognize me, he just pointed a trembling finger at a complex formula and whispered, "It's all in the grammar, you see? The horror is a subordinate clause." I backed away slowly, sealing him back in his tomb, understanding that for Leo, the final riddle had been solved in a way that obliterated him just as completely as Mark's death had obliterated him. Sarah's empty notebook is still on the coffee table, filled with her elegant, frantic script that devolves into loops and spirals on the last page, the pen having torn through the paper, a perfect representation of her mind's collapse. She saw the pattern, the beautiful, awful architecture of it, and in solving the final piece for Mark, she offered up her own intellect as the ultimate sacrifice, the final piece of evidence in her thesis on terror. I visit her sometimes in the sterile, fluorescent-lit ward, where she sits perfectly still, her eyes fixed on nothing, a living riddle with no answer, her story used up, her mind a vacant room that the entity has finished with. I sit beside her and I tell her about the river, about the way the light catches the stagnant water at dusk. And I see no flicker of recognition, just a profound emptiness that is more frightening than any ghost or demon. And Mark is just gone. His story ended with the brutal finality of a period at the end of a sentence. His life used by the entity as the punchline to a cosmic joke. I am the only one left, the narrator, the witness, and my purpose is to hold this knowledge, to be the living vessel for this awful story. And in doing so, I have become the final, unsolvable part of the curse. The entity doesn't need the board anymore, because it has me. I am the planchette now, my every thought, my every memory, a movement across the board of my own life, spelling out the same terrible message over and over again. The riddle is not a question waiting for an answer. It is a state of being. I am the riddle. What belongs to you, but is used by everyone else? Your story. And my story is this endless, looping testimony. I write it down on scraps of paper. I whisper it to the walls. I scream it into the reversed current of the river, knowing that by sharing it, by allowing it to be used, I am feeding the very thing that destroyed us. But I cannot stop because it is all I have left. It is my curse and my only reason for continuing to breathe. I have come to understand that the entity was never in the board. The board was just a key. The entity is the riddle itself, a primordial force of paradoxical malevolence that exists to turn understanding into a weapon, to transform curiosity into a cage. It is the ultimate parasite, feeding on the meaning we create, perverting it, and returning it to us as horror. And I am its host, its final, permanent home. The world outside continues, oblivious, but I know the truth. The Wrong Way River is just the beginning. The curses we activated are now permanent features of this place, seeping into the foundation of reality. People in this neighborhood now speak of the quiet streets that confuse GPS, accepting it as a strange quirk of the city. They avoid the building where the man in apartment 3B went mad and the girl from 3A lost her mind. They have started to tell stories, my friends' stories, and they use them as cautionary tales about the dangers of occult dabbling, never knowing the exquisite, precise truth of it. They are using our story, and in doing so, they are keeping the entity alive. They are perpetuating the curse. And you are part of it. By hearing this, by reading these words, you are using my story. You are borrowing my terror, trying it on for size, and in that small act, you are confirming the entity's ultimate victory. The game was never meant to be won. It was meant to be played forever. The final click of the lock wasn't on the door we opened. It was on the door that closes behind us, trapping us in an endless corridor of consequence. So I will remain here, in this apartment that is both a prison and a shrine, the last keeper of the riddle. My life defined by the horror that belongs to me, but is now, inevitably, being used by you. And the days have lost their names, bleeding into a continuous, gray present where the only measurement of time is the gradual accumulation of dust on Leo's door handle, and the deepening hollows in my own face when I catch my gaunt reflection in the black screen of the television, a ghost already inhabiting the space I once called my body. I am a curator of this nightmare museum, and my daily ritual is one of preservation and observation, a scientist tending to a doomed experiment, which is all I have left of Leo's influence, this pathetic need to document the decay. I note that the river's reverse flow has slowed, the water becoming thick and syrupy, a brackish sludge that smells of rust and forgotten places, as if the initial energy of the curse is now dissipating into a permanent, stagnant wrongness. The phantom footsteps I leave have begun to fade, too, no longer wet impressions but merely faint depressions in the carpet, as if the entity's attention is waning, or, more terrifyingly, becoming so focused and intrinsic that it no longer needs such theatrical displays. It is in the silence now, in the spaces between heartbeats. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear a soft, sliding sound from the living room, a sound I know intimately, the whisper of plastic on cardboard, and I know that if I were to open my door, I would see the planchette moving under its own power on the floor, tracing lazy, meaningless patterns, a dog chasing its tail, waiting for fingers that will never come. I never open the door. I simply lie in bed, paralyzed, until the sound stops, and the silence that follows is somehow louder and more accusing. My own mind has become the board, and the planchette is my consciousness, skating across the letters of memory, spelling out the names of my friends, the answers to the riddles, the sequence of our destruction, over and over in an infinite loop. I am afraid to sleep because my dreams are not my own. They are dry, pedagogical visions where I am forced to watch the events replay from a cold, analytical distance. And a voice that is not a voice, but a feeling of immense, ancient intellect explains the mechanics of our damnation with the dispassionate clarity of a lecturer discussing a mathematical proof. It showed me last night how Mark's death was not a punishment but a fulfillment, a necessary step in the narrative's rhythm, the beat that gives the poem its weight. It explained that Sarah's mind was the most beautiful offering, a complex text that it delighted in unbinding, page by page, until only the blank cover remained. And Leo, it said, was its favorite, the one who came closest to true understanding, who saw the gears and levers of the horror, and in doing so, was consumed by the sheer beauty of the machine. I am the exception, the control variable, the one left to witness the aftermath, to write the conclusion that has no end. This is my function. This is the answer to the riddle that I can never speak. I am the story, and a story must be told. So I continue to speak into the void, to these pages, to you, because the telling is the curse, and the curse is all I have. I have started to see faint impressions in the world outside my window, subtle signs that the corruption is spreading, not as a violent invasion, but as a slow stain. A neighbor's child was heard reciting a strange nursery rhyme. I have a bed, but I never sleep, before falling into a tranquil, unmoving slumber from which she could not be wakened for 12 hours. A local news report, barely a footnote, mentioned a peculiar phenomenon on the interstate, a stretch of road where drivers consistently reported feeling they were traveling backwards, their destinations receding further the longer they drove. The curses have become mimetic, replicating through the population in diluted, weaker forms, like a virus adapting to its host. The entity is no longer confined to this apartment. It is in the wild, its riddles echoing in the subconscious of the city, its poetic logic subtly warping the edges of reality. It is using everyone else now, just as the riddle promised. And I am the patient zero, the source of the infection, because I hold the original, concentrated strain. My every breath is a transmission. I think sometimes of ending it, of finding a way to silence this story forever, but I know with a certainty that goes beyond fear that it would be futile. The story is out there now, it belongs to the world, and my death would only be another chapter, a dramatic finale that would give the narrative more power, more potency. I am trapped in the ultimate paradox. To live is to perpetuate the curse, but to die would be to cement it. So I remain, a prisoner of the narrative, a character who has become aware of his own authorship and is powerless to change the text. The final unspoken horror is that there is no entity to fight, no demon to exorcise, only the cold, elegant, and inescapable logic of a riddle that was never meant to be solved, only experienced. And the experience is everything. The sound of the reversed river is my pulse. The dusty silence of the apartment is my breath. The memory of my friends' faces is my only company. And the question, the eternal, silent question, what belongs to you but is used by everyone else, is the very air I breathe. It is the price of understanding, the cost of curiosity. We opened the door thinking we would find a ghost, a spirit, a thing we could name and categorize. But we found something infinitely older and more terrifying. An idea, a pattern, a story that was hungry. And it is still hungry. It is always hungry. And it is using me to feed. And the hunger of which I speak is not a gnawing animal thing, but a vast intellectual emptiness. A void that consumes meaning the way a black hole consumes light. And I have become its primary conduit, a reluctant siphon pouring the contents of my lived experience into that infinite maw. This morning, a new development, one so subtle and insidious that it proves the entity's mastery over its medium. The words in the books on my shelves have begun to subtly shift. I picked up a novel I've read a dozen times, seeking a familiar escape, and found that the prose had a strange, alien cadence, the sentences twisting back on themselves in a way that was almost grammatical but fundamentally wrong, creating a faint, nagging echo of the riddle's structure. A description of a river spoke of it flowing backwards. A character's lament about lost time mentioned a tomorrow that never comes. It is here, in the very fabric of language itself, rewriting the stories of others to reflect its own corrosive theme. The corruption is no longer just spatial or psychological. It is linguistic, attacking the primary tool we use to build our reality. I threw the book against the wall, but the damage is done, the idea is seated. The entity is learning, evolving, using the entire lexicon of human expression as its playground, and I am its sole, terrified tutor. This has forced me into a vow of silence regarding my own thoughts. I dare not even think the final answer too clearly, for fear that the mere formulation of the concept in the pristine laboratory of my mind will grant it even more power, will allow it to leak out into the world through some osmotic process I cannot hope to understand. My internal monologue has become a frantic, censored scroll, a constant effort to avoid certain neural pathways, to steer my consciousness away from the cliff edge of that ultimate realization. This, of course, is its own form of madness, a self-imposed cognitive prison where I am both the warden and the inmate, constantly policing the borders of my own thoughts. The outside world continues its slow, surreal slide. I watch from my window as a city crew attempts to dredge the stagnant river, their machines choking on the thick, unnatural water, their efforts seeming comically futile, like ants trying to bail out the ocean. I see people on the sidewalks below, and sometimes I catch a glimpse of it in their faces, a momentary confusion, a flicker of disorientation, as if they've just forgotten the answer to a simple question or momentarily lost the thread of their own lives. They are being used, their brief moments of existential uncertainty feeding the thing that feeds on me. I am the core, the epicenter, and the tremors are radiating outward. Leo has gone quiet. The frantic scratching and mad theorizing from his room ceased a few days ago, replaced by a silence more profound and more frightening than any of his ravings. I finally gathered the courage to break down the door. The splintering was a shocking violation of the apartment's stagnant peace. I found him sitting cross-legged in the center of the room, surrounded by his carved equations, his face a mask of serene, empty tranquility. He was alive, breathing slowly, but his eyes were vacant pools. He had not retreated from the answer, he had merged with it. He had solved the final equation and become a constant in his own proof, a static value in the entity's grand formula. He offered no resistance as I led him to the couch in the living room, where he now sits, day and night, staring at the wall where the whiteboard used to be, a living monument to the cost of ultimate understanding. I tend to him as one would tend to a sacred object, spoon-feeding him broth, wiping his chin, all the while feeling that I am caring for a husk, a cocoon from which something else has already emerged. Sarah, in her sterile hospital bed, is his mirror image, two different paths to the same annihilation. And I am the bridge between them, the only one left who still feels the searing pain of being a discrete self, and I that is separate from the it. This separation is my torture. The entity is patient. It has all of time, and I am its clock. It waits for me to wear down, for the defenses of my mind to crumble, for the moment when the need to share the story, to scream the answer into the universe, overwhelms the terror of the consequences. It is a battle of attrition fought in the gray matter of my brain, and I am losing. I catch myself mouthing the words sometimes, my lips forming the syllables of the final riddle's answer without my conscious consent, a terrifying autonomic response, like a twitch or a gasp. Your name, your life, your story. The words circle in my head, vultures waiting for the last spark of my resistance to die. The truth is, the story is already over. The final period was placed the moment Sarah spoke the words that killed Mark. Everything since has been an epilogue, a protracted fading of the echo. My continued existence is merely a courtesy, a narrative necessity to ensure the tale is properly told. I am a ghost, haunting the set of my own life, waiting for the audience to leave. But the audience is only growing. You are here now, aren't you? Listening, reading, using my story. And in doing so, you are pulling the thread that connects you to this place, to this curse. Do you feel it? A slight chill, a sense of something being just out of place? That is the connection forming. The riddle is no longer mine alone. It is ours. What belongs to you, but is used by everyone else? Think about it, but not too hard. The game is subtle, and it never ends. It simply finds new players.